Hi everyone and welcome back to the Retro Shack, and in this episode we're looking at something that truly changed the entertainment industry forever when it was released in 1977. Nope, not that. Nor that. Not a movie.
Don't give up on us, baby.
Fine, I'll just tell you. It's this. The Atari 2600, and there's finally one here in the shack, and this one has quite an interesting backstory. Let's take a look. Here at the Shack, we'd like to give a huge thank you to the sponsor for this video, PCBWay. They help us out with all of our PCB fabrication needs and make fantastic boards at amazingly competitive prices. And it's not only PCBs that are on the menu. Apart from other fabrication services like CNC machining, 3D printing, sheet metal fabrication and injection moulding, PCBWay also have a great projects library of cool stuff to build from people all around the world. Oh, and if you don't like waving a soldering iron about, they can even assemble your PCBs for you. That's the PCB way. Right, on with the show. So, a little while ago I received an intriguing email from a chap called Andy Pine with the somewhat trepidatious subject line, "I've got a Woody." Taking the plunge, I do get some strange messages from time to time. I opened the email to begin an interesting dialogue that had my mind melting. Now, it has to be said that the following misunderstandings and wayward wanderings of my mind were in no way the fault of Andy. My brain is entirely at fault, but hopefully you'll see why, and ultimately you'll see why none of this confusion actually mattered, because what we ended up with is fascinating in its own right. Okay, so Andy's email opened up with, "Evening Mr. and Mrs. Retro Shack. Hopefully the email subject got your attention." Well, yes it did. You may have possibly guessed what this relates to. It's an Atari 2600 Woodgrain console. However, this isn't any old Woodgrain Atari 2600, this is dear old late Uncle Clive's Woodgrain console. Why is that special, you may ask? Well, because Clive was a bit of a tinkerer and modder all the way back in the 70s and 80s, long before the internet and pre-packaged solutions. Clive modded his Atari 2600 to play home-burned EPROMs. Back in the early 80s, I'd have been knee-high to a grasshopper, so don't know exactly what he did or how he got copies of the games to burn, and he's now no longer with us to ask. I found his beloved Atari 2600 that I remember playing on with Uncle Clive and Auntie Angela in his loft. I'm sure Uncle Clive would have been thrilled to see it restored to former glory. Is this something the Shack would like to tackle? Now, at this point my brain was going gaga. I knew of only one person who is often referred to as Uncle Clive, and my memory was telling me that he was also married to Angie Bowness, Angie being short for Angela, of course. Could this really be Sir Clive Sinclair's own old Atari 2600? Well, after a couple more email exchanges, no, it's not. But as it turns out, Clive Sinclair wasn't the only clever Uncle Clive around in the 1980s. Andy's Uncle Clive was an interesting fellow also. Okay, let's set the scene. It's the early 80s and the Atari VCS was everywhere, having gained incredible popularity following the release of a licensed copy of the arcade game Space Invaders, followed by another belter, Pac-Man. The VCS went on to sell over 30 million units in its lifetime and had over 520 games released during that time. Now, back in the 1980s, piracy was of course rife across the home computer industry, but the home video game consoles hadn't suffered in the same way. Of course, piracy did exist in consoles, but it was effective at a much larger scale and relied on huge expense in setup and materials to accurately counterfeit the hardware. Realistically, the costs are the same for a legitimate cartridge than for a counterfeit one, and arguably cheaper for the official manufacturer to produce, as they could buy components in much higher quantities and get volume discounts. However, companies like Atari relied on profits from cartridges to make their money, as they made little profit on the console itself. This is true even today. Most modern consoles are sold at almost cost price and the money comes from the games. And Andy's Uncle Clive, being a clever bunny and not afraid to jump in with a soldering iron, began to tinker with the VCS to see how he could modify the machine to allow him to effectively copy games and play them on his own VCS. Which led him to not modifying the VCS at all. More, it led to this, a cartridge for the VCS which has two external ZIF sockets. And here is Clive's game collection, each game burnt onto two EEPROMs and labelled 1 and 2. To play a game, simply pop each EEPROM into its respective socket, pop it into the VCS, and lo and behold, you're playing that game. Now, of course, this is nowhere near as resilient as the actual cartridges, as you're prone to all sorts of things going wrong here. Bending the pins on the chips whilst you put them in and out, or simply through rough handling. Electrostatic discharge, destroying the chips, putting them in the socket the wrong way round, etc, etc. But presuming you're being careful, you've got yourself a legitimate, or rather illegitimate, working game cartridge. Andy tells me he has no idea where his uncle got the original games from. Presumably he must have either had the original cartridges to read from, but that would have meant desoldering each game to get the chip out to put it in a reader. Or alternatively, perhaps Clive had access to a bulletin board or user group where the files were readily available. Such bulletin boards were commonplace at the time, and policing them was practically impossible, as many were whitelisted and only accepted connections from members verified by the owner. In a future episode, I'll be diving into the world of bulletin boards, so stay tuned for that. About half of these games work and half don't, and as Andy suggests, a bit of pin bending and cleaning may help to get the rest working. I'll also be looking at more modern multi-cartridge solutions in the next episode, so we can see how much things have moved on and how much actually they've stayed the same. The technology inside these VCS consoles was incredibly limited even back in the day, and we'll cover that in more detail when we get to refurbishing the console itself in the next episode. When we look inside these cartridges, we'll see that when a game doesn't work, like this one, there's not really a lot that can be at fault. We should note that the design of the machine allowed for game cartridges of up to 4K. Each of the EEPROMs that plug in these ZIF sockets is 2K in size, which is why we need two of them to hold the game code. Not all games fully utilised the full whopping 4K. Combat, for example, was crammed into a 2K space. Opening up Clive's multi-game cartridge shows us two things. That it is in fact an original cartridge with the ROM removed, and that there's very little going on in terms of logic, with only this one unmarked logic chip on the whole board. I later discovered that this is a 74LS04 and it's marked on the underside. Odd. This logic chip is an inverter, so may be being used to change the active high signal that the console generates to an active low signal that the chips require. I'll have to do a little digging to find out. Other than that, there's not really a lot in here. We can see what looks like probably the original Space Invaders cartridge PCB, and the ROM has been desoldered and removed, then wires have been run from the old chip socket to the new EEPROM ZIF sockets. Memory is accessed via the address bus, so as long as both of the address lines on the ZIF sockets are mapped to the same pin on the original socket, the console will have access to the data on both EEPROMs. Now, what I find amazing is that all of this was figured out back in the day without access to the internet and to help from millions of people at the drop of a hat. The fact that as far as Andy knows, Uncle Clive figured all of this out with nothing but an oscilloscope and lots of time is really quite something. So given how simple this homebrew cartridge is, let's take a look inside this official cartridge and see what's going on in there. I'm not expecting much, to be honest, and yes, very simple indeed. There is in fact no logic at all on this cartridge. There's merely the ROM itself that contains the code, and each of the pins from the chip is mapped directly to the edge connector. And when we compare the Combat cartridge with the Space Invader cartridge, we can see that there's no difference at all, it's just the ROM itself that changes. So all of this got me to thinking that I think I'll have a go at building my own cartridge and programming it. So that's what I'm going to do in the next episode, along with a full refurbishment of the Atari itself, the joysticks and the rotary paddles, which are all a bit flaky. Along with the new cartridge and the refurbishment of the machine, I'd like to also perform a composite modification so we don't have to use that nasty RF output, and it appears there are a number of ways to do that. So please stay tuned for the next episode in the series. Apologies, it's been a while since the last video. I've been a bit poorly, but on the mend now and back in the swing of things. Thanks so much to Andy for sending in this little gem, and thanks to Uncle Clive wherever you are, and sorry for confusing you with that Sinclair bloke. Please note that I don't condone piracy of any kind, but do find the ways that it's been achieved over the years to be very interesting indeed. I hope if you're a regular viewer that you've subscribed, and of course please leave your comments below. Did you have an Atari 2600? Did you have bootleg games? Let us know, and we promise not to inform the authority. So until next time in the shack, it's goodbye from me.